Look, I'm like St. Thomas, you know, because there are things that we need to see to believe, right? But what if I told you that on the map of Southeast Asia, right in the Indonesia region, there is a line that exists, but what's invisible? She is responsible for some bizarre differences concerning the fauna and flora of the two most iconic islands of Indonesia, Borneo. Red, Sulawesi, follow me. You are celebrating. That little devil there is the Wallace Line, named in honor of the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who, by no coincidence, is a co-discoverer of the theory of evolution, alongside another well-known figure of ours, Charles. On the west side of the Wallace Line, that is, west of Borneo, the fauna is typically Asian, including animals like elephants, tigers, and orangutans, as well as birds, amphibians, and typical Asian insects. Meanwhile, in the west, on the celeb side, everything changes. In the east, the oddball species from Oceania, like for example, marsupials, the Komodo dragon, the white cockatoo, the babirusa, which is a type of lizard with long horns, and wide-eyed monkeys of the taxi genus. The disparity between the two sides of the line is so vast that the biological difference at this point on the planet becomes greater than the differences between the speech of England and of Silly. In fact, it's quite intriguing to think about it, especially since the Wallace Line begins at the end of the Philippines archipelago, passes along the strait between Borneo and Sulawesi, and heads south, between Bali and Lombardy. The most interesting thing is that in the strait between Borneo and Celebes, there's an oceanic strip only 3 miles wide, 120 kilometers wide, already between Bale and London. The distance drops to a mere 30 kilometers.
In this sense, Alfred W. Wallenstein
discovered all this when he began researching in Oceania back in the 19th century, but hold on, we'll get there. Before that, around 1847, he was here in Brazil, specifically on the Amazon River. While he was in our country, Wallace noted that the Amazon River and its main tributaries, they formed borders for various groups of animals, particularly monkeys. Actually, not everything in Wallace's journey to Brazil was rosy, okay? In fact, his return to Europe was a disaster. It's because the ship he was traveling on caught fire, and practically his entire collection, with the notes and everything else, burned up. With all this trouble here in South America, the scholars saw that the best place to explore would be the Malay Archipelago. Sometime later, Wallace set off for Malaysia, a little British government boat on which he stayed for 45 years. 5 days to get to Singapore on the 20th of April, 1854. There, he decided to venture into this region of the map, gathering information about the plants and animals of the area. The journey through the Malay Archipelago lasted, guess how long, folks? During this period, the naturalist traveled over 22,000 kilometers and changed residences over 80 times. It's almost like moving house once a month. And the effort was worth it, since the naturalist collected data on 125,000 species, many of which he studied when he returned to Great Britain. But information was not the only thing Wallace gathered in the Malay Archipelago. Also contracted malaria and suffered from very high fever. From the top ones, the ones that make anyone rave. But this sickness had a silver lining, because it was in one of these delusions that he managed. Hey, I've been in this place for quite a while and figured out
that animals behave in a certain way from one perspective.
And on the other side, that's why the
that
difference.
path.
I will gossip about it with my colleague Tati. That's the torch. This made Wallace forever known as the father of biogeography. That is the field of science that studies the geographical distribution of living beings on our planet. And believe it or not, folks, Wallace indeed sent a letter to Darwin talking about a name, a lot of things he had observed. That's why some scholars nowadays dispute Darwin's primacy when it comes to the theory of evolution by selection. Natural. At that moment, Darwin was also in the scientific race to discover more about the evolution of species. But despite having reached similar ideas, he and Wallace came from very different backgrounds. Darwin was wealthy. He came from a traditional family, was involved in academic circles, spent years studying, and so on. While Wallace never attended university, he was self-taught and continued to learn even while running a show. In his travels around the world, his thirst for knowledge was so great that by his early 20s, Wallace had read everything regarding the type of account that existed at the time and that made some mention of the transformation of species. Times, the theorist, even when I was young, I was already convinced that species transform over time. That's why they went looking for an explanation for those doubts that troubled him. Darwin, on the other hand, wasn't so worried about it. When he embarked on the Beagle in the year 1836, the inquiry into the changes sought, dying in species, and what led to this transformation only matured in Darwin's mind during the 5 years of the Beagle's journey. That is widely known, in which he traveled through several continents. However, these different origins did not prevent their paths from crossing. So much so that in 1850, in 1988, Wallace sent the infamous letter to Darwin along with a manuscript titled
About the tendency of varieties to indefinitely drift away from the type
Original, which were the result of that dream he had while delirious with fever from malaria. In other words, Wallace had quite robust data there about natural selection and the evolution of species. And if he wanted, he could have published everything first. But no, he chose to pass his findings to Darwin, who in 1859 published On the Origin of Species and the Rest. It's a story to nurture in the minds of conspiracy theorists. That's all right, isn't it? Wallace feverish delirium dreamed and concluded that on the west side, in the Borneo region, the animals behaved differently. The animals on the east side, in the Celebes region, were different. That's fine. But he not only noticed and observed this, he also researched it thoroughly to try to unravel the reasons for this phenomenon. The researcher realized how the animals spread around the world. As he concocts, it also had to do with geology. That's when he deduced that at some point, the islands in the west of Indonesia had split into
We've
two.
all been connected to each other.
And also with the Asian continent. And if we look at the map, we'll see that these islands are surrounded by a much rarer sea today. Then Wallace had the following reflection. These islands, they are only islands now because of the rising sea levels. In the past, they were mountaintops of the Asian continent. If that's the case, it makes total sense to think that the animals from the islands west of Indonesia didn't get there by swimming. They were already in that place. And the sea level rose, so much so that they could no longer live. Kiss me and the Eastern Islands. Well, for the scholar, Australia was a great continent in the past. And these islands would be remnants of that big Australian continent. Wallace also thought that species couldn't cross from one side to the other of the line because along it, there was a super strong ocean current. Strong, besides the fact that the sea is very deep in this area. Following this line of thought, the naturalists almost completely solved the mystery. Because at the time, scientists were unaware of a very important subject. In this case, plate tectonics, which is a theory that was only accepted in the mid-20th century. Recalling that Wallace ran in 1913. That's why we understand that our planet's surface isn't static. On the contrary, it moves all the time, and the tectonic plates are so powerful that they can create various features of our planet. Planet as continents, mountains, volcanoes, and it's worth mentioning that the Malay Archipelago is one of the regions with the most complex plate tectonics in the world. Since Malay is one of the most complex regions in the world, that it's a meeting point of various plates constantly clashing, covering the whole area with space. So, the answer to this puzzle lies in continental drift, the movement of the plates. Drag continents back and forth. In the 19th century, Wallace had already identified that two large continents there had existed in this area, the Sunda continent to the west and Jisahu continent. And today, when we look at the map, we notice that these islands are quite close. However, there was a time when they were far apart from each other, across these continents. Everything changed in roughly 25 million years from now, with a little basic help from the tectonic plates, which did their job, dragging the lands from one side to the other. Wallace, who could have been the guy behind the theory of evolution, had to settle for the co-author position, and with the line that bears your name.